A new beginning. The sun rose gently over the quiet suburban street, casting a warm glow on the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. This was the Johnson family's first morning in their new home, a two-story brick house with an expansive lawn and a sprawling oak tree in the front yard. For Malcolm and Nina Johnson, this was the start of a new chapter, a fresh opportunity for their family, especially for their 8-year-old daughter, Lisa. Lisa stood on the front porch, her dark curls bouncing as she looked around with wide, curious eyes. The neighborhood was unlike anything she'd ever known, clean, orderly, and quiet. Nina watched her daughter from the doorway, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was their dream home, but moving to a predominantly white neighborhood had been a big step. Nana knew that challenges might come, but she also knew they were here to give Lisa the best opportunities. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Nana asked, resting a hand on Lisa's shoulder. Lisa tilted her head, gazing up at the towering oak tree. "Can we put a swing on that tree, Mom?" Nina chuckled, feeling a hint of her own tension ease. "We'll see. First, let's get everything unpacked." Just then, Malcolm walked up from the driveway, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's the last of the boxes. What do you say we celebrate with some pizza?" he suggested, flashing a proud smile. Pizza. Lisa's eyes lit up with excitement. Later that evening, they sat on the floor of their still bare living room, eating pizza out of a box and toasting with cans of soda. The house was filled with laughter and dreams, each family member eagerly sharing what they hoped this new beginning would bring. "I can't wait to set up my art studio," Nina said, her eyes shining. "No more commuting to the city. I can work from home now." Malcolm wrapped an arm around her shoulder, "And I'm ready to start fresh at the new firm. It's a bit of a drive, but it'll be worth it." Lisa looked between her parents, her face beaming. "What about me? Do you think I'll make friends here?" Nina and Malcolm exchanged a quick, reassuring glance. "Of course you will, sweetie," Nina said gently. "You're smart, funny, and kind. Everyone will love you." As they talked, an undercurrent of unease tugged at Nina's heart. Moving to this neighborhood had meant venturing into unfamiliar territory, a community that didn't look much like them. They were the only black family on their street, and maybe even in the entire neighborhood. They had discussed this late at night, weighing the benefits of better schools and safer streets against the possibility of being unwelcome. "We're doing this for Lisa," Malcolm had said during one of those discussions. "She deserves every chance we can give her." But as Nina looked around their new home, she couldn't shake the feeling of apprehension. She hoped they'd made the right choice, that Lisa would find a sense of belonging here. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Nina found herself feeling optimistic. She helped Lisa get dressed, packed her a lunch, and walked her out to the bus stop. Today would be Lisa's first day at her new school. As they waited, Nina brushed her hand over Lisa's curls, straightening her backpack straps. "Remember, if you feel uncomfortable about anything, you can tell me or your dad right away, okay?" Lisa looked up at her mother, nodding with wide, serious eyes. "I know, Mom. You've told me, like 100 times. Nina chuckled, a bit embarrassed. "Well, it's only because I love you so much. You're going to do great, honey." Just then, the rumble of an engine echoed down the street, and a bright yellow school bus pulled up, its doors creaking open. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a polite smile, looked down at them from his seat. "Good morning," he greeted, his tone cordial, if a bit distant. Nina smiled, feeling her own nervousness surge. "This is Lisa's first day," she explained. The driver nodded. "Welcome aboard, Lisa. I'm Mr. Glover," he said, gesturing for her to step on. Lisa glanced back at her mother, a slight flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Nina gave her an encouraging smile and mouthed, "You got this." Taking a deep breath, Lisa climbed onto the bus. As she disappeared into its depths, Nana caught a glimpse of the other children. Most of them looked curious, and a few even smiled, But Nina also noticed a couple of stairs that felt unsettlingly cold. The bus doors closed, and as it pulled away, Nina felt a pang of worry that she couldn't quite explain. Malcolm squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her. "She'll be fine, Nina. It's just a new place." But even as he said it, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his own eyes. The day felt agonizingly slow for Nina, who paced around the house, setting up her home office but frequently glancing out the window. Was Lisa making friends? Were the teachers nice? She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off, though she tried to convince herself it was just first-day jitters. Finally, the rumble of the bus returning pulled her from her thoughts. She rushed outside just in time to see Lisa hopping off, her face bright with a forced smile that Nina didn't quite recognize. "Hey, sweetie, how was your first day?" Nina asked, wrapping her daughter in a hug. Lisa hesitated before answering, her voice chipper but slightly strained. "It was good. My teacher is really nice, and I made a friend named Sarah." Nina felt a surge of relief. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." As they walked back inside, Lisa mentioned her lunch and the new books in the library, carefully choosing words to keep her mother's spirits high. But Nina noticed a subtle shift in her daughter's demeanor, a quietness that wasn't there before. It was a small change, but Nina couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa was holding something back. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Lisa was animated, recounting the exciting parts of her day. Malcolm listened attentively, nodding and asking questions. But halfway through, Lisa paused, her face suddenly clouded with discomfort. "Our bus driver. He's a little weird," she murmured, glancing down at her plate. Malcolm and Nina exchanged a quick glance. "What do you mean, honey?" Malcolm asked carefully. Lisa shrugged, pushing a piece of broccoli around her plate. "I don't know. He looks at me funny. And he didn't let me sit where I wanted to." Nina felt a shiver run down her spine. "Did he say anything to you?" Lisa bit her lip, thinking. "No, not really. He just looked kind of mean." Trying to remain calm, Malcolm reached out and squeezed Lisa's hand. "Remember, if anything makes you uncomfortable, you can tell us." "Okay." Lisa nodded, but her face still held a hint of apprehension. She quickly shifted the conversation back to her new friend Sarah, as if eager to move on. Later that night, after tucking Lisa into bed, Nina and Malcolm sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, their faces etched with worry. "Do you think it's nothing?" Malcolm asked, his brow furrowing. Nina shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right. The way she talked about him. I've never seen her look so uneasy." Malcolm sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe we're overthinking it. She's just a kid, adjusting to a new place. Kids are sensitive, especially when everything is so unfamiliar." "Maybe," Nina agreed reluctantly. But her mother's instinct gnawed at her, a quiet but insistent alarm that she couldn't ignore. As she lay in bed that night, Nana's mind raced. She tried to dismiss the warning signals, tried to tell herself that Lisa's worries were just a part of starting fresh in a new environment. But the words kept echoing in her mind. "He looks at me funny." In the days that followed, Nana noticed Lisa becoming quieter, her once bubbly personality dimming each time she stepped onto the school bus. Gone were the animated stories and the enthusiastic recounting of her day. Instead, her answers became shorter, more guarded, as if she was holding back something that she couldn't or wouldn't share. Nina's unease deepened. She knew she had to get to the bottom of this. But how? She didn't want to push Lisa too hard, but she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter facing something terrible alone. A plan began to form in her mind. Tomorrow, she would follow the bus herself, keeping a safe distance and watching closely. She would find out if her fears were unfounded, or if something truly sinister was hiding behind Mr. Glover's polite smile. Nina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of worry settle over her. This was only the beginning of a journey she hadn't expected, a journey that would reveal truths more shocking than she could have ever imagined. Following the shadows, Nina spent the next morning pacing by the front window, watching the clock and waiting for the school bus to arrive. Her heart was a knot of anxiety as she prepared to follow the bus for the first time. She had tossed and turned all night, haunted by the look in Lisa's eyes and her unusual silence when describing Mr. Glover. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than Lisa was willing or able to say. As she watched from the window, Lisa walked out of the house, her backpack hanging loosely from her shoulders, her usual cheerful expression missing. She looked so small, standing alone by the curb, glancing back at her mother with a forced smile that did little to hide the tension in her face. Nana felt her heart break a little, wondering what could have changed her once lively daughter into a quiet, withdrawn girl. The rumbling sound of the school bus grew louder as it turned the corner and came to a stop in front of their house. The doors opened, and Mr. Glover greeted Lisa with a curt nod. Lisa hesitated, her eyes darting back to Nina, as if seeking reassurance. Nana smiled, giving her a thumbs up, trying to convey confidence she didn't feel. As Lisa boarded the bus, Nana grabbed her car keys and hurried outside, waiting until the bus had pulled ahead before starting her car and falling into line behind it. She kept a safe distance, hoping that Mr. Glover wouldn't notice her following. Her pulse quickened with every stop, her eyes glued to the bus as it picked up more children along the route. Nina's mind raced with questions. Was she being paranoid? Was she overreacting, letting her fears get the better of her? Malcolm had tried to reassure her, dismissing her worries as a mother's overprotectiveness. But the uncertainty gnawed at her, relentless and insistent. Something was wrong. She could feel it. As the bus made its way through the neighborhood, Nina observed how Mr. Glover interacted with each child. He seemed polite enough, but she noticed something odd at each stop. He barely acknowledged the other children, but his gaze lingered on Lisa, his eyes following her in a way that felt unsettling. Nina's stomach tightened. Could it be that Lisa's unease was justified? At one point, the bus stopped longer than usual, and Nina watched as Mr. Glover spoke to Lisa, leaning slightly toward her. Lisa's shoulders hunched, and she nodded stiffly, her gaze fixed on the floor. From where she sat in her car, Nina couldn't make out the words, but the exchange left her feeling cold. Finally, the bus arrived at the school. Nina parked a few blocks away and watched as the children filed off. Mr. Glover placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder as she stepped off, his grip lingering just a second too long. Lisa pulled away, her face tense, and hurried toward the school entrance. Nina's fists clenched on the steering wheel. Her instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. Returning home, Nina tried to settle into her work, but her mind kept drifting back to what she'd seen. She had expected to feel relief after following the bus, but now her worries had only deepened. She wondered if she should bring it up with Malcolm, but after his reaction the previous night, she hesitated. He had already brushed off her concerns once, and she didn't want another argument. This was something she needed to handle on her own. When the school day ended, Nina was waiting by the bus stop, her heart pounding as she watched the bus pull up. Lisa got off, her expression distant, her steps slow. Nina wrapped her arm around her daughter as they walked back to the house. "How was your day, sweetie?" Nina asked, keeping her tone light. Lisa shrugged, barely looking up. "Fine," she muttered. Nina swallowed, feeling a pang of helplessness. She didn't want to push, but she couldn't ignore her intuition. "Did anything happen on the bus today?" Lisa hesitated, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting away. "No, Mom. Everything's fine." The words felt rehearsed, as if Lisa were trying to convince herself as much as her mother. Nana bit her lip, unsure of how to reach her daughter. She decided to wait a little longer, hoping Lisa would eventually open up on her own. That evening after dinner, Lisa went to her room without the usual excitement of her nightly bedtime story with her parents. Nina and Malcolm exchanged a worried glance as they cleared the table in silence. Finally, Nina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Malcolm, I followed the bus today." Malcolm looked at her, surprised. "What? You followed Lisa's bus?" Nina nodded, bracing herself for his reaction. "I had to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And I think there might be a reason Lisa's been so quiet." Malcolm's expression softened, his concern evident. "What did you see?" "Mr. Glover, the bus driver, he was watching her. Not the other kids, just her. And when they got to school, he even put his hand on her shoulder." Nina's voice trembled as she spoke, the words feeling heavier with each one. Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe he's just a friendly guy, Nina. Bus drivers are supposed to watch the kids, make sure they're safe." "I know, but this was different," Nina insisted, her voice breaking. "It's like he was focused on her, and only her. I'm worried, Malcolm. I'm really worried." Malcolm looked at her, a conflicted expression on his face. "I don't know, Nina. I want to believe you, but what are we supposed to do? We can't accuse him of something without proof." Nina bit her lip, frustration mounting. "I don't know, but we can't ignore this. If something is happening to Lisa, we need to protect her." Malcolm nodded slowly, his face grave. "All right, let's keep an eye on things for now. Maybe we should talk to Lisa's teacher, see if she's noticed anything unusual." The next day, Nina called the school and arranged a meeting with Lisa's teacher, Mrs. Flanders. That afternoon, she arrived at the school, her heart pounding as she walked down the long hallway. Mrs. Flanders greeted her warmly, inviting her to sit. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," Nina began, her voice filled with apprehension. Mrs. Flanders smiled reassuringly. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson. How can I help?" Nina took a deep breath. "I've been worried about my daughter, Lisa. She's been very quiet since we moved here, and she's mentioned that she feels uncomfortable with the bus driver, Mr. Glover." Mrs. Flanders' smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "I haven't noticed anything unusual in class, but now that you mention it, Lisa has seemed a bit withdrawn. I assumed it was just the adjustment to a new school." "Do you know anything about Mr. Glover?" Nina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Flanders hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "Mr. Glover has been a bus driver here for a long time, and he's well liked in the community. But," she trailed off, a troubled expression on her face. "But," Nina prompted, her heart racing. "Well, there have been a few complaints over the years, mostly from parents who thought he was too strict with the kids. Nothing ever came of it, though, and the complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings." Mrs. Flanders' gaze softened as she looked at Nina. "But if you're worried about Lisa, trust your instincts. You're her mother. You know her best." Nina left the meeting feeling a mix of relief and dread. Mrs. Flanders' words had confirmed her fears, but they hadn't given her a solution. She still didn't have any concrete evidence, but she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. She would have to be vigilant, watching for any changes in Lisa's behavior and doing whatever it took to keep her safe. That night, as she tucked Lisa into bed, Nina leaned down and stroked her daughter's hair. "You know you can tell me anything, right, sweetie?" Lisa looked up at her, her big brown eyes filled with an emotion Nina couldn't quite place. "Yes, Mom. I know." Nina hesitated, then pressed on. "If anyone ever does something that makes you uncomfortable, even if it's just a look or something they say, you can tell me. I won't be mad. I'll just be here to help." Lisa nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Okay, Mom." As Nina left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was hiding something, a truth too painful or frightening for her to reveal. She resolved that she would follow the bus again the next day, hoping that this time she would uncover the evidence she needed. The following morning, Nina watched from her car as the bus stopped in front of their house. Lisa hesitated, looking back at her mother, a flicker of fear in her eyes. Nana gave her an encouraging nod, but as the bus doors closed, a chill ran down her spine. This was more than a mother's intuition. Something was happening, something dark and hidden, and she would not rest until she uncovered the truth. Unraveling the darkness. The next day dawned gray and overcast, casting a somber light over the neighborhood. Nina's unease weighed heavier than ever, her stomach twisted with the same dread she'd felt the day before. She had already resolved to follow the bus again, but this time she would be more prepared. If there was something wrong with Mr. Glover, she needed proof. She grabbed her phone, ensuring it was fully charged and ready to record if necessary. Lisa seemed even quieter that morning, her usual bright demeanor replaced by a tense silence. Nina watched her daughter closely as they waited by the curb, trying to ignore the guilt gnawing at her. She felt as though she was sending her daughter into danger, but until she could confirm her suspicions, she didn't know what else to do. When the familiar rumble of the bus engine grew closer, Nina's heart raced. The bus pulled up, and the doors opened to reveal Mr. Glover's impassive expression. He nodded briefly at Lisa, his gaze shifting momentarily to Nina with a look she couldn't quite decipher. A shiver ran down her spine. As Lisa climbed the steps, she glanced back at her mother, her eyes wide and searching. Nana gave her a reassuring smile, hoping to mask her own worry. She mouthed, "I love you," and watched as Lisa disappeared into the depths of the bus. Once the doors closed and the bus pulled away, Nina climbed into her car, keeping a safe distance as she followed. She noticed again how Mr. Glover's attention seemed to focus on Lisa every time she glanced toward the back of the bus, through the rear window. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once she saw it, Nina couldn't unsee it. As the bus wound through the neighborhood, Nina kept her phone ready, recording every interaction she could observe from the rear window. She saw Mr. Glover glance back at Lisa far too often, his expression unreadable but focused. The way his gaze lingered sent chills down her spine. At one of the stops, she saw him lean over and say something to Lisa, though Nina couldn't hear what it was. Lisa flinched visibly, shrinking into her seat, and the expression on her face broke Nina's heart. Whatever Mr. Glover had said clearly made her uncomfortable. The school came into view, and the children began filing out of the bus. Nina parked her car across the street, watching closely. When it was Lisa's turn, Mr. Glover placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that might have seemed friendly to an outsider, but to Nina, it looked possessive and inappropriate. She bit her lip, anger simmering beneath her fear. Lisa hurried away from the bus, her steps quick and nervous. Nina took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She needed more than just her suspicions. She needed undeniable proof. She decided that she would talk to Lisa directly that evening, but she had to be careful not to frighten her daughter. She wanted Lisa to open up willingly, without feeling pressured or scared. When Lisa came home that afternoon, Nina noticed the slump of her shoulders and the way she avoided eye contact. Her daughter's once bright spirit seemed dimmed, replaced by a sadness that Nina hadn't seen before. She wrapped an arm around Lisa, hoping to convey the comfort and support she so desperately wanted to offer. "How was school today, sweetie?" Nina asked, keeping her tone gentle. Lisa shrugged, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It was fine," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Nina sighed, knowing she needed to tread carefully. Did anything happen on the bus? For a brief moment, Lisa's expression shifted. Her eyes widened, and her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. But she quickly looked away, her face shutting down as if she were trying to hide something. "No, Mom. Nothing happened." Nina bit her lip, trying to hold back her frustration. She knew something was wrong, but she also knew that pushing Lisa too hard might make her retreat even further. "Honey," she said softly, crouching down to her daughter's level, "you know you can tell me anything, right? If something is bothering you, or if someone is making you uncomfortable, you can talk to me. I'm here to help." Lisa looked at her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. For a moment, it seemed like she might open up, but then she looked away, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I'm fine, Mom," she whispered. "Really?" Nina felt her heart break a little as Lisa turned and walked to her room, closing the door behind her. She stood there, helpless and frustrated, her mind racing with questions and fears. She needed answers, but Lisa's reluctance to speak left her at a loss. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. That night, as Malcolm returned from work, Nina brought up the issue again, her voice tense with worry. "Malcolm, I followed the bus again today," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think there's something wrong. Mr. Glover keeps looking at Lisa in this strange way, and he even put his hand on her shoulder when she got off the bus." Malcolm looked at her, his face etched with concern. "Did he say anything to her?" "I couldn't hear," Nina admitted, feeling a pang of frustration. "But Lisa's acting so different, Malcolm. She's not her usual self. I just know something is going on, but she won't talk to me." Malcolm nodded slowly, his gaze troubled. "Maybe we should go to the school and speak to the principal. If Mr. Glover is doing something inappropriate, they need to know about it." Nina's face brightened slightly at the suggestion. "Yes, that's a good idea. Maybe the school can do something if we bring it to their attention." The following morning, after seeing Lisa off on the bus, Nina and Malcolm drove to the school and requested a meeting with the principal, Mrs. Holloway. She welcomed them into her office, her expression calm and professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, how can I help you today?" Mrs. Holloway asked, folding her hands neatly on her desk. Nina took a deep breath, glancing at Malcolm before speaking. "We're concerned about our daughter, Lisa. She's been acting withdrawn and anxious lately, and we believe it may have something to do with her bus driver, Mr. Glover." Mrs. Holloway's brows furrowed. "Mr. Glover? He's been with us for years. I've never heard any complaints about him." "I understand," Malcolm replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "But our daughter has mentioned that she feels uncomfortable around him, and Nina has noticed him behaving in ways that seem unusual." Nina nodded, her voice wavering slightly. "He keeps looking at Lisa, focusing on her, and he's been physically close in a way that doesn't seem right." Mrs. Holloway listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll speak to Mr. Glover and look into this matter personally. We take the safety and comfort of our students very seriously." Relieved that the school would at least be aware of the situation, Nina and Malcolm left the office with a renewed sense of hope. Maybe this would be enough to protect Lisa, to put an end to whatever was happening. But despite the reassurances, Nina's heart still felt heavy. She knew it would take more than a conversation to ease her fears. That afternoon, when Lisa returned home, Nina could sense her daughter's exhaustion. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her once bright spirit seemed faded, worn down by an invisible weight. Nina knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Lisa, honey," she said gently, "did anything unusual happen today?" Lisa shook her head, her expression guarded. But then, as if unable to hold it in any longer, she whispered, He looked at me again, Mom. And he asked if I'd like to sit up front tomorrow." Nina's blood ran cold. Her fingers tightened around Lisa's hand, but she kept her voice steady. "Did he say anything else, sweetheart?" Lisa hesitated, her small hands trembling. He said he'd give me a special treat if I sat up front, but I don't want to." Nina felt a surge of anger and fear twist in her chest. She hugged Lisa tightly, her heart pounding with both relief and terror. Relief that her daughter had finally confided in her, and terror at the implications of what she'd revealed. "Thank you for telling me, Lisa," Nina whispered, holding her daughter close. "You don't have to sit up front if you don't want to, okay? You never have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable." Lisa nodded, her small frame relaxing slightly in her mother's arms. Nina felt a renewed sense of determination. She wouldn't wait any longer. She had spoken to the school, but now it was time to take this to another level. She would not let her daughter be in any further danger. That night, after Lisa had gone to bed, Nina and Malcolm sat together in the living room, discussing their next steps. Nina recounted what Lisa had told her, her voice shaking with anger. "We need to call the police, Malcolm. This has gone on long enough," she said firmly. Malcolm nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "You're right. We need to do everything we can to keep her safe." As Malcolm dialed 911, Nina felt a mixture of fear and relief. She was terrified of the unknown, of what Mr. Glover might have planned. But she was also relieved that they were finally taking action. She would stop at nothing to protect her daughter, even if it meant exposing the secrets hiding within their seemingly perfect neighborhood. In the days that followed, Nina and Malcolm would uncover truths that went far deeper than they had imagined, truths that would shake the foundations of their community and reveal the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. The call for justice. That night, after Malcolm placed the call to 911, the Johnsons waited anxiously for the police to arrive. The house was steeped in an uneasy silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of footsteps as Nina paced back and forth, her thoughts racing. She felt a mix of anger, fear, and guilt. Her little girl had been living in fear, enduring something no child should have to experience, and Nina blamed herself for not acting sooner. When the police arrived, 2 officers stepped inside. A middle-aged man named Officer Taylor, with graying hair and a calm demeanor, and his younger partner, Officer Martinez, who looked slightly uncomfortable, as though he hadn't handled many cases involving young children. Nina and Malcolm sat with them in the living room, explaining everything that had led up to this moment. Nina could see Malcolm's jaw tighten each time she mentioned Mr. Glover's interactions with Lisa. I feel like I should have done something earlier," Nina admitted, her voice choked with emotion. "Lisa's been acting so different since she started riding the bus, and I didn't realize how bad it was." Officer Taylor nodded, his expression serious. "It's not uncommon for children to hide things from their parents, especially when they're scared. But you did the right thing by calling us. We'll do everything we can to ensure Lisa's safety." The officers asked to speak with Lisa, and Nina felt her heart sink as she went to get her daughter. She knew this conversation would be difficult for Lisa, but it was necessary if they were going to put an end to whatever Mr. Glover was doing. She found Lisa in her room, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "Sweetie," Nina said gently, kneeling beside her, "there are some police officers here who want to ask you a few questions. They're here to help, and they just want to make sure you're safe." Lisa looked up, her eyes wide and fearful. "Am I in trouble?" Nina's heart ached as she shook her head. "No, honey, you're not in trouble. You've been so brave, and now they just need to know what happened so they can keep you safe." With a small nod, Lisa allowed her mother to lead her to the living room, where she sat beside Nina, clutching her hand tightly. Officer Martinez offered Lisa a gentle smile. "Hi, Lisa. I'm Officer Martinez. I just want to ask you a few questions, okay? You can take your time, and you don't have to answer anything you don't want to." Lisa looked at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Lisa began to recount her experiences on the bus, her voice barely above a whisper. She described the way Mr. Glover looked at her, how he often asked her to sit closer to the front, and the strange things he'd say to her when no one else was listening. He told me I was special," Lisa murmured, her gaze fixed on the floor. "He said that if I sat up front with him, he'd give me treats and let me off the bus first. But I didn't want to sit up there, so he got mad." Nina squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling anger and protectiveness swell within her. Officer Taylor exchanged a grim look with his partner before asking, "Did he ever do anything else that made you uncomfortable?" Lisa hesitated, biting her lip. "One time, he tried to hold my hand. He said he wanted to make sure I was safe when I got off the bus, but it didn't feel right." Malcolm clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He leaned forward, his voice tight with restrained anger. Why would a grown man need to hold a child's hand to keep her safe? Officer Taylor nodded solemnly. "We'll be looking into this, Mr. Johnson. Given what Lisa has told us, we'll open an investigation on Mr. Glover. In the meantime, it might be best if Lisa doesn't ride the bus." Nina exhaled, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. "Thank you, officers. I just want to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Officer Taylor handed her a business card. "If you think of anything else, or if Lisa remembers anything, please don't hesitate to call us. We'll keep you updated on the progress of the investigation." As the officers left, Nana felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew this was only the beginning. They had taken the first step, but an investigation could take weeks or even months. She looked at Lisa, whose small frame seemed so fragile, yet whose spirit had shown so much resilience. Nina hugged her daughter tightly, whispering words of comfort. Over the next few days, life in the Johnson household changed. Malcolm drove Lisa to school each morning, refusing to let her near the bus, while Nina worked from home, ready to pick her up at the end of the day. They kept a close eye on her, hoping that the nightmare was over. But Nina knew that healing would take time. Word of the investigation quickly spread through the neighborhood, and the whispers grew louder. It wasn't long before neighbors and parents from Lisa's school began gossiping, questioning the Johnsons' motives and Mr. Glover's character. Mr. Glover had been the bus driver in this community for nearly 20 years, and he was well liked by many of the families. People were hesitant to believe that he could do anything wrong. One evening, as Nina was unloading groceries from her car, she noticed a woman from down the street watching her, arms folded and a frown on her face. "I heard about the accusations against Mr. Glover," the woman said, her voice laced with suspicion. "Do you really think it's necessary to make a big deal out of this? I've known Mr. Glover for years. He's driven my children to school without a single problem." Nina bristled, forcing herself to stay calm. "My daughter feels unsafe around him. She told us things that no child should have to experience. I'm not going to ignore that." The woman sniffed, shaking her head. "Well, people can be mistaken, especially kids. Sometimes they just misunderstand things." Nina clenched her jaw, holding back the anger building inside her. "My daughter is not mistaken, and I will do whatever it takes to protect her." Turning on her heel, Nina walked back into the house, her hands trembling. She couldn't believe the audacity of people who would rather question a child's word than consider the possibility that someone they trusted might not be what they seemed. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, and Nina realized that standing up for Lisa might come with its own set of challenges. The next day, Nina received a call from Officer Taylor. His voice was steady but cautious. "Mrs. Johnson, we've spoken to Mr. Glover," he said. "He denied everything, of course, but given Lisa's account and the potential risk, we're suspending him from his route pending further investigation. We'll also be reviewing any past complaints that might have been overlooked." Nina felt a small surge of satisfaction, but knew this was only a temporary victory. "Thank you, Officer Taylor. I appreciate everything you're doing. Just know that this process can take time," he added. "And, unfortunately, there's a chance that some people in your community might not be very supportive." Nina sighed, thinking of the woman from the previous evening. "We're prepared for that. All that matters is keeping Lisa safe." As days turned into weeks, the investigation wore on. Malcolm and Nana became increasingly protective of Lisa, staying close and reassuring her whenever she showed signs of fear. They watched as their once bright, joyful daughter slowly regained her spirit, her laughter returning in small bursts. But each day that the case remained unresolved felt like a reminder that justice was not yet served. One evening, while the family was having dinner, there was a loud knock on the door. Malcolm stood up, exchanging a wary glance with Nina, and went to answer it. Standing on their porch was Mr. Glover, his face drawn and angry, his eyes filled with a mixture of indignation and hatred. "Mr. Johnson," he spat, his voice dripping with venom, "I don't know what lies you've been feeding the police, but you're not going to ruin my life over some misunderstanding." Malcolm held his ground, his jaw clenched. "There's no misunderstanding. You made my daughter uncomfortable, And now we're making sure you won't do that to anyone else." Mr. Glover took a step forward, his face twisted with anger. "You people come into this neighborhood and start throwing around accusations, tearing down good, decent people. I won't stand for it." Nina stood up, stepping beside Malcolm. "This isn't about tearing anyone down. This is about our daughter's safety. You made her feel unsafe, and we're not going to ignore that." Mr. Glover sneered, his face red with fury. "People like you don't belong here. Maybe you should take your family and go back to where you came from." The words hung in the air like poison, and Nina felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness rising within her. "We're not going anywhere, Mr. Glover. This is our home now, and we're not going to be intimidated by you or anyone else." With a final glare, Mr. Glover turned and stormed away, muttering under his breath. Malcolm closed the door, locking it with a sense of finality. Nina's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around Lisa, who had been watching from the hallway wide-eyed and scared. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, holding her daughter close. "He can't hurt you. We won't let him." As they stood together in the quiet of their home, Nina knew that they were fighting more than just one man. They were challenging an entire community's willingness to ignore uncomfortable truths. But she was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. Little did they know, the investigation would uncover a pattern of misconduct far more disturbing than they could have imagined, exposing secrets that would leave the community reeling and reveal the depth of Mr. Glover's betrayal. Secrets exposed. In the days following Mr. Glover's confrontation at their doorstep, Nina and Malcolm felt the impact of his anger ripple through the neighborhood. The morning after his visit, they found their garbage cans tipped over and broken glass scattered across their driveway. Later, they discovered their mail missing and even overheard whispers when they ventured out to the grocery store. Neighbors they'd previously greeted with friendly nods now looked away or, worse, glared openly. It was clear that word had spread, and people were choosing sides. But Nina and Malcolm refused to back down. They knew that protecting Lisa was their top priority, and they would not be intimidated. They kept close contact with Officer Taylor, who continued to gather evidence for the investigation, though he warned them that the process might be slow and painful. It wasn't easy to take down someone who had woven himself so deeply into the fabric of the community. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table going through bills, Nina's phone rang. It was Officer Taylor. She exchanged a quick glance with Malcolm before answering, her heart pounding. "Nina, I thought you'd want to know." Officer Taylor began, his voice grave. "We've uncovered something in Mr. Glover's record. It turns out that this isn't the first time there have been complaints about his behavior with children." Nina felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean?" "There were similar complaints filed about 5 years ago in a different school district," Officer Taylor explained. "Parents reported that he had made inappropriate comments and even tried to get some of the kids to stay late on the bus after their routes were done. But each time, the complaints were dismissed. He was well-liked, had connections, and always seemed to talk his way out of trouble. The school district let him go quietly, no formal charges filed, and he moved here soon after." Malcolm clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he listened. So they just let him move on, knowing what he'd done. Officer Taylor sighed. "Unfortunately, that's how it often goes. Schools don't want the negative publicity, so they settle these things quietly. They don't want parents pulling their kids out, or a scandal that could affect the district's reputation. And people like Glover, they know how to manipulate others, how to hide behind a friendly facade." Nina struggled to process the information, anger and disgust boiling within her. So all this time, he's been working with children, and nobody stopped him. "We're working on it," Officer Taylor assured her. "Now that we have this background, we can bring it to the district here as part of our investigation. It'll be harder for them to ignore it if there's a pattern of behavior. But we need you and Malcolm to stay strong, especially since the community might not be as supportive." "Thank you, Officer Taylor," Nina said, her voice tight. "We're not going anywhere. We'll see this through." After the call ended, Nina and Malcolm sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Mr. Glover had a history, a dark, disturbing history that had been ignored time and again. Now he'd found a new community that was willing to protect him rather than believe a child's word over his own. That night, Nina and Malcolm made a decision. They would not just rely on the police investigation, they would also bring their story to the school and to the parents in their community. People needed to know who Mr. Glover really was, even if it meant facing more backlash. The following day, they scheduled a meeting with the school's principal, Mrs. Holloway. When they arrived at her office, she looked weary, as if the situation with Mr. Glover had already begun taking its toll on her. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Mrs. Holloway greeted them, folding her hands on her desk. "I'm aware of the police investigation, and I understand that this is an incredibly difficult time for your family. But I do want to emphasize that Mr. Glover has been with us for years, and he's well regarded by many in the community." Nina took a steadying breath, feeling the familiar surge of anger. "With all due respect, Mrs. Holloway, being well regarded doesn't make someone trustworthy. Mr. Glover has a history, a record of complaints from other schools. This isn't just a misunderstanding." Mrs. Holloway's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. "We're looking into these allegations, Mrs. Johnson, but you must understand, there's a legal process we have to follow." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice firm. "And in the meantime, Lisa is left vulnerable, along with every other child on that bus." Mrs. Holloway sighed, her gaze faltering. "I understand your concerns. For now, Mr. Glover has been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. It wasn't the decisive action Nina had hoped for, but it was something." As they left the meeting, she felt a flicker of hope. They were making progress, even if it was slow. However, the real battle began when they tried to talk to other parents. Nina and Malcolm attended a school board meeting that evening, hoping to raise awareness about Mr. Glover's behavior. But as soon as they mentioned their concerns, they were met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright hostility. A man in the back row, one of Mr. Glover's longtime supporters, stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. I've known Henry Glover for 20 years. He's driven my kids, my grandkids. He's never done anything inappropriate. You're dragging the good man's name through the mud." Another parent chimed in, crossing her arms defiantly. "These kinds of accusations can ruin lives, you know. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Children can be sensitive, especially when they're in a new environment." Nina's hands shook with frustration, but she refused to back down. "Lisa isn't making this up, and this isn't the first time complaints have been made against him. We're only here because we want to protect our children. If he's innocent, then the investigation will show that. But if he's not, shouldn't you want to know that?" The room fell into a tense silence, the faces of the other parents a mixture of doubt, anger, and discomfort. They didn't want to confront the possibility that someone they trusted could be a threat to their children. They would rather believe in the illusion of safety than accept the truth. Feeling defeated but resolute, Nina and Malcolm left the meeting, aware that they had made themselves targets in the community. But their commitment to Lisa's safety outweighed any fears of retaliation. They couldn't abandon their daughter now, not when she needed them the most. A few days later, Officer Taylor called with news that shocked them both. "We've discovered that Mr. Glover kept personal records, journals, if you will. In one of them, we found entries that suggest an unhealthy interest in certain students." Nina felt her blood run cold. What do you mean?" "It's as bad as it sounds, Mrs. Johnson," Taylor replied grimly. "He's been documenting his thoughts about certain children, including behaviors he finds interesting. This is disturbing evidence, but it strengthens our case. We'll be able to use it to support formal charges." Malcolm covered his face with his hands, his whole body shaking with anger and grief. How could he do this? How could he get away with this for so long? Officer Taylor hesitated. "It's hard to understand, But people like him know how to manipulate. They hide behind a mask of trustworthiness and charm, relying on the community's goodwill. They know that people are more likely to question a child's word than their own. As the investigation moved forward, the tide in the community slowly began to turn. Parents who had once defended Mr. Glover now looked at him with suspicion and fear. Some even approached Nina with apologies, ashamed that they hadn't believed her sooner. But for the Johnsons, the damage was already done. They had been shunned, threatened, and harassed, all because they had dared to protect their daughter. Nina knew that things would never be the same in this neighborhood, and that perhaps, for their own peace of mind, they might have to leave it altogether. The final blow came when Mr. Glover's arrest made the local news. The police charged him with several counts of child endangerment and misconduct, thanks to the evidence found in his journals. As the story spread, parents across the district came forward, recounting experiences that they had brushed aside, moments that now felt sinister in retrospect. It was clear that Mr. Glover's dark past had been covered up for far too long. The day after the arrest, a few neighbors gathered outside the Johnsons' home, looking ashamed and contrite. One of them, a mother whose son had also ridden Mr. Glover's bus, stepped forward. "Nina, Malcolm," she began, her voice heavy with guilt. We should have believed you. I'm so sorry. We were wrong to question you." Nina felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she accepted the apology. "Thank you. We just wanted to protect Lisa and everyone else's children too. I hope this never happens again." As they watched the neighbors walk away, Nina felt a strange sense of closure. They had fought for Lisa, and though it had come at a cost, they had uncovered the truth and protected their daughter from harm. But even with Mr. Glover in custody, the scars of this ordeal remained. Lisa had faced fear and betrayal, and Nina and Malcolm had learned the painful reality of standing up against a community unwilling to face its own darkness. They had lost friendships and fractured their sense of belonging, but they had gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that they had done everything they could to keep their family safe. And as they looked toward an uncertain future, Nina and Malcolm knew that no matter where life took them, they would carry this hard-won resilience with them, a testament to the strength of their love for Lisa and the unbreakable bond that would see them through whatever lay ahead. Moving forward, the arrest of Mr. Glover sent shockwaves through the town. What had once been whispered suspicions and dismissals now turned into a full-blown scandal that shook the community to its core. Parents who had once defended him now found themselves grappling with guilt and shame, forced to reckon with the fact that they had ignored red flags to maintain their sense of normalcy. The days following Mr. Glover's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and quiet conversations behind closed doors. Reporters descended on the neighborhood, their cameras flashing, while townspeople tried to avoid being caught in the spotlight. For the Johnsons, life was equally turbulent. Their home became a sanctuary and a fortress, a place where they could process the ordeal in peace, away from prying eyes. Nina and Malcolm struggled with mixed emotions. They had won, in a sense. They had protected Lisa and exposed a man who had taken advantage of his position for far too long. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the cost they had paid along the way. Friends had turned their backs, neighbors had gossiped and shunned them, and their reputation in the community had suffered. One afternoon, Officer Taylor visited their home with an update on the case. He sat with Nina and Malcolm in the living room, his expression somber yet respectful. "Mr. Glover has been formally charged with multiple counts of child endangerment, as well as a few other charges related to his misconduct," Officer Taylor explained. "With the evidence we found in his journals and the testimonies of other children, there's a strong case against him. He likely won't be able to avoid a lengthy prison sentence." Malcolm nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "Good. He deserves to be held accountable for everything he's done." Officer Taylor offered a sympathetic smile. "You should both be proud of yourselves. It's not easy to stand up against a community that doesn't want to see the truth." Many parents would have backed down, but you kept fighting. Because of you, he'll never hurt another child. As Officer Taylor left, Nana felt a surge of relief mixed with exhaustion. The battle was finally ending, but she knew that the scars of this experience would remain. She looked at Malcolm, her husband who had stood by her side every step of the way, and felt a swell of gratitude. They had endured so much together, and their love had only grown stronger through the storm. Later that evening, they sat down with Lisa, who had been listening from the hallway. Her face was a mixture of relief and lingering fear, and Nina knew that it would take time for her daughter to feel safe again. But she also knew that Lisa was resilient, far more than they had ever realized. "Sweetheart," Nina began, taking Lisa's hand, "Mr. Glover won't be able to bother you or anyone else ever again. You're safe now." Lisa nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know, Mom, but I don't want to ride the bus ever again." Nina felt a pang of sadness but understood completely. "You don't have to, honey. We'll take you to school ourselves, as long as you need us to." Malcolm leaned in, wrapping an arm around Lisa's shoulders. "You were so brave, Lisa. Telling us what happened, trusting us. That took a lot of courage. We're so proud of you." Lisa looked up at her parents, her expression softening. "I was scared, but I knew you'd believe me. You always believe me." Nina's heart ached with a bittersweet pride. She knew that Lisa's trust had been the foundation of their strength throughout this ordeal. They had been tested in ways they'd never anticipated, and the love and trust they shared had carried them through. In the weeks that followed, the Johnsons made the decision to move away from the neighborhood. The community's initial hostility had left them feeling isolated, and though some neighbors had apologized, the wounds were too deep to ignore. They needed a fresh start, a place where they could rebuild without the shadows of Mr. Glover's betrayal and the townspeople's judgment. The move was bittersweet. Their home had been filled with memories: birthday parties, family dinners, quiet evenings by the fireplace. But it was also a place where their family had been tested, where they had faced one of the darkest chapters of their lives. As they packed their belongings, they each felt a sense of closure, a readiness to leave the past behind. On their final day in the neighborhood, a few neighbors stopped by to offer their goodbyes. Some apologized, their faces red with shame, acknowledging their failure to stand by the Johnsons when it mattered most. Others offered empty pleasantries, refusing to confront the deeper truths. Nina and Malcolm accepted each farewell with grace, choosing to leave with their heads held high. As they drove away, Lisa looked out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. She was quiet, her gaze thoughtful. Nina reached over, taking her daughter's hand. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked softly. Lisa nodded, her voice steady. I think I'm ready to start over." Nina smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Her daughter had been through so much, but she was emerging from the darkness stronger than ever. Their new home was in a different town, far enough away to escape the lingering whispers of their former neighborhood, but close enough for Malcolm to keep his job. The house was smaller, cozier, nestled on a quiet street lined with trees. It felt like a place where they could finally breathe again, where they could begin to heal. The first few months were challenging as they adjusted to their new surroundings. Lisa started at a new school, and though she was initially nervous, she soon began to make friends. Nana watched as her daughter's laughter returned, her spirit rekindled. Slowly, the shadows of Mr. Glover's actions began to fade, replaced by the light of new beginnings. Nina herself found solace in their new community. She joined a local support group for parents, sharing her experiences and finding comfort in the stories of others who had also faced difficult battles for their children. In these meetings, she met mothers and fathers who understood the weight of standing up for what was right, even when it came at a cost. Malcolm, too, found peace in their new life. He took up running, often spending early mornings jogging through the tree-lined streets, feeling the weight of the past slip away with each step. He and Nina grew closer than ever, their shared ordeal strengthening their bond, and deepening their love. They had survived the storm, and now they were building a life together in its aftermath. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lisa joined them, her face thoughtful. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice steady. "I want to help other kids. Kids who might be too scared to tell someone what's happening to them." Nina felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. You're so brave, and I think you could make a real difference." Lisa smiled, her eyes shining with determination. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did. I want them to know that someone will believe them." In that moment, Nana saw the strength that had carried her family through the darkest days. It was a strength rooted in love, in courage, and in the unbreakable bonds that held them together. She reached out, pulling Lisa and Malcolm into a hug, feeling the warmth of their family surrounding her. As they held each other, Nina knew that the memories of their past would always be with them, but they would no longer define them. They had faced darkness and come out the other side, stronger, braver, and ready to embrace the future. In the years that followed, the Johnsons found peace in their new life. Lisa continued to grow into a resilient, compassionate young woman, dedicated to helping others and advocating for children's safety. Nina and Malcolm supported her every step of the way, proud of the daughter who had taught them the true meaning of courage. Together, they had faced a battle that had tested their faith, their love, and their strength. And together, they had won. The Johnsons were no longer just survivors. They were a family bound by an unbreakable love, ready to face whatever life had in store. As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting their new home in a warm golden glow, Nana felt a sense of calm settle over her. They had come so far, and they would continue moving forward, always together. The past was behind them, but the lessons they had learned would remain forever, a reminder of the power of family, of standing up for the truth, and of the unshakable love that had carried them through.